Hello, Logan. Welcome back to the Wax Museum.
Thank you. I think it's my first time being a return guest on a show that wasn't mine.
I don't even remember when that was, actually. I've got it up on screen here. It was like, do Christians worship the Bible? And the answer
Mhm.
was yes, right?
The answer was it's nuanced, I think.
Yeah. It's like after all of that. Now y'all are going to have to listen to it to find out what the nuance actually was on that. But how are things with COVID-19 and everything for you?
Well, it's very different. I mean, so I'm on here to talk about a book, and
Mm.
normally with a book release, I'd be doing library events and I'd be doing readings in bookstores and that kind of thing. I tend to do like a local sort of mini tour with stuff around my town.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
None of that's happening now. you
Mm-hmm.
know um just social distancing and all that stuff. And I mean, like a lot of places, we're starting to see spikes in our areas and that sort of thing. So I mean, it's very different. I mean, we're meeting in person for my church, but we're doing it, socially distanced, masked, Sunday mornings only,
Mm-hmm.
the rest of it virtual, all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I mean, like everybody else, it's kind of, there've been logistical challenges for that. And I mean, I think also relational challenges as people deal with isolation and depression and, all the stuff that goes with that. Some of which is unavoidable, but it's
Yeah.
still part of the cost of the whole thing.
Yeah, it's tough. I just got back from like 8 days at an oil field site. And fortunately, because I didn't really, fortunately, they had somebody else handling all the COVID response stuff. And
Yeah.
so I honestly, I put together some like PPE kits. And so, it's like you had to have gloves, you had to have like a respirator, and there was all this stuff. And so I spent, I think, like 3 or 4 hours doing that on one of the days. But it's like, but there's just the logistics of like, if you have anybody who's sick on site and it's a camp, it's like, oh, we got to get this person out of here, right? And so
Mm.
it's quite a bit. I guess those guys basically do that full time right now. So I was there to do the other industrial hygiene work because there's other stuff to the job, right? So,
Yeah.
anyways, but man, it was crazy, and it's good to be back home and back podcasting. I finally finished reading your whole book. I think thank you so much for the advanced copy. I was like, this is fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
So basically, okay, Prison in the Sky, humans are essentially exiled, and they're subservient to aliens and cannot survive very long on the planet. Um, like basically 40 years is your life expectancy for a human on this planet. And I'm thinking I'm actually turning 43 in December. I'm like, so I'd be like past my expiry date in this book. It's kind of sad, but I've lived a pretty good life. So you can sense like so much desperation, in this entire book. What is the purpose in envisioning humanity in this way?
So a lot of it has to do with the central character's arc. So one of the things I had noticed, so this is my fourth novel, and in my
Mm,
first three, I tended to have protagonists who were angsty and bold. Right.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
so one of the things I wanted to do with this story is I wanted to look at somebody who is in super desperate circumstances, also doesn't have the biggest spine in the world. I mean,
mm,
Liam, he wants to do a lot of good, right? There's a lot that he wants to do. He's also really non-confrontational.
mm-hmm.
And he's very timid when it comes to a lot of these things. And so what I wanted to do is paint a world in which you're kind of backed up into a corner. You're in really desperate circumstances. And then there are some other kind of social themes at play here too that I did not intend on exploring, but kind of came out as I was writing the book. And so the the idea of humans not being able to survive very long on the planet, that's part of that package of desperation. And I also I also find it, just on a practical matter, very hard to believe that any alien planet that would actually exist that we would go to would be especially well suited for life on planet Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And because so sometimes you hear about these exoplanets that look really similar to Earth that NASA discovers or whatever, and you look at them and like it's true that comparatively speaking they're a lot more similar to Earth than say like Pluto or Neptune or Uranus or something like that, but they still are not ones that we would just be able to chill out exactly like we do on planet Earth. And
Hmm.
so those kind of pieces all came together to look at a planet that was especially hostile to life for humans, but because the Grolic species would have evolved on the planet, they would have adapted to the circumstances in their own particular way, and so it's not a particular problem for them.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now I'm kind of thinking of it from like an industrial hygiene point of view, and I'm like, maybe there's like high sulfur dioxide content or something, because it was like lung issues, wasn't it? Like it was
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
something about the atmosphere, so it's like eventually it just wears it down. Normally it's just irritating. Um, anyways, I love the names for things in this. Like, did you basically create like a language for this?
So I didn't create a language in the Tolkien sense. I
Mm.
tried to more create. I tried to create words that stuck with a certain aesthetic. And
Mm-hmm.
so the idea behind the Grolic language is it's short, it's gruff, and it's very. I kind of thought of it in at times of German if every German word was one syllable is kind of.
Yeah, it did feel German. I liked that too. My mother's German, so it's like, yeah, I identify with that. Um, yeah, and I mean, and I said that like I was thinking that too. The aesthetic of the book, it's like this alien world just seems so real as I read it, and it's like, so would you be able to like, do you think there's like inspirations that led to you kind of building this aesthetic?
Yeah, a couple. So one is Paralandra by C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis is most well known, of course, for the Chronicles of Narnia and his
Yeah.
Christian apologetics works. What I actually think is his best work, or at least my favorite of his work, is his space trilogy, which is
Yes.
really undervalued, I think. Now, I'm saying this as a sci-fi author, of course, I think that,
Right.
right? But so Out of the Silent Planet is the first book, Paralandra is the second. That one is my favorite.
Hmm.
And then the third one is That Hideous Strength, which is really really weird, but I really like the first two a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
they really get into really interesting descriptions of like the foliage and stuff like that, but also the way that sometimes physics works and climate works
Mm-hmm.
differently
Mm-hmm.
on these planets. So that was a big inspiration in terms of trying to come up with sort of a way the planet operates. It's a little bit unique. And then a lot of how the kind of the city operates is everything is sort of in tiers. And so instead of walking on the ground, you're walking on grading on these different levels to the city.
Mm-hmm.
And the levels that you are on represents where you are in kind of the hierarchy or the social structure. And
Wow.
the idea behind that is the metaphors that we use to talk about social structure and the obstacles to sort of being able to make your life better, right? We talk about that in terms of vertical metaphors, especially ladders. Like
Yes.
you'll hear the term ladder used a lot, or like the term glass ceiling, it kind of also has
Right.
a vertical connotation to it. So it was kind of both of those things in one. And I have always really liked steampunk and the steampunk
Mm.
aesthetic. And so, like, all I have a very, very amateuristic hobby in drawing and sketching and stuff like that. And
Mhm.
so, so there are accounts I follow on like Pinterest and Instagram and stuff like that. And so some steampunk artwork would also appeal to me while I was kind of developing this story. And so all of those things kind of coalesced into one when it came to developing the world itself.
So interesting. Like it's just I feel like you're thinking in 3D. Like I think as
Yeah.
a musician, I'm kind of like I don't think of it as a 3D thing. Like I guess it's like, you got the music, you got the words, but it's like when you're actually authoring a book, it's like you have to think like a movie maker, really, where
Mm-hmm.
you have to think in 3D and you're kind of building this actual it's like a physical world that your characters have to interact in, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's Yeah, I always find it interesting to talk to creatives in different areas because it's like, oh, that's crazy. Okay, So I liked your steady reveal. It's similar to Lost. Where it's just kind of like you're like, well, how did we get here? And eventually you find out how we got here. But it's like
Mhm.
kind of, I don't even know, like, is there a word for that that kind of way that an author reveals?
Um, I mean, there might be. If there is, I don't know what it is.
But it's like I could see that's what you were doing, and so it's like, how do you map a story like that? Like, did you map it forwards and then decide how you're going to reveal it after, kind of thing, like work backwards?
Kind of. So, this book was a few years in the making. So I wrote the first draft to this during NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. For those that
Hmm.
don't know, it's a challenge where you write
Right.
50,000 words in the month of November. And so I'm trying to remember exactly what year this was. So my son was a baby. He's now 5.
Wow.
So this would have been, I guess this would have been around 2016. um, that I would have been. So I wrote the first draft, and the backstory of how we get there was not in the first draft. And the first draft was not really outlined very much. It
Mhm.
took a lot of editing, which is kind of how I operate. I tend to draft a first draft quickly and then take like 2 years to edit.
Hmm.
And so now I will have multiple drafts finished at one time, but it takes me a long time to edit. And so the first draft just had what you kind of see in the present tense developing, but I had developed the ideas of how we got here.
Hmm.
And the first draft kind of had a reveal of Liam learning more of that story, and initially that backstory was very different
Hmm.
for how that story developed. So after, when I went through and was doing some rewriting for the second and third and fourth drafts, I decided that that was a story that I thought that was an interesting side of the story, and so I decided to actually formally include that. And so I already had, by virtue of doing the first draft, which was not really very strictly outlined when I put the initial story down, but I kind of had the benefits of outlining, and that the story was already pretty developed when I added that subplot in, so to speak.
Man, the creative process. I think part of it too is like I always find like, and I think this is probably, I'm assuming this is true for any creative process. It's kind of like you're discovering something that already exists,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
it's just like, oh, well, this fits with this, and it's like, and you almost sense like you're divinely inspired. And I find it's kind of funny when I talk to creatives, who struggle with their faith. I'm like, well, where do you think all this is coming from?
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. I have kind of this very niche hobby horse might be soapbox. That's where I'm looking for. I have this very niche soapbox, which is, I really think that part of being made in the image of God is actually creation, like being people who create in and of
Yeah.
themselves. Now, not
Yeah.
everybody is a creative in the same sense, right?
No.
But I think about, like, one of the first things that God does after he creates Adam and Eve is he puts them in a procreative relationship, right?
Hmm.
And like, I don't think that's an accident. Now, writing is not literally procreation, but I think the creative instinct that a lot of people have does go back to being created in the image of God. Um, and you see that sometimes in the way people write. One of my favorite writers is Ray Bradbury. And in the edition of Fahrenheit 451 that I have, there's
Hmm.
like a Q&A interview with him at the end of it.
Mhm.
And he the interviewer reads him a quote from another writer whose name I didn't recognize, basically saying, I tell the characters where to go and they do it. And he said, that is a terrible way to write, is what Bradbury said. He was like, the characters do what they want, I just write it down.
Mhm.
And like, that is kind of the way that I operate. Now, like, sometimes I might say that I nudge them in directions, right? Like, it's not purely a, like, I'm seeing a vision and then writing it down. But I find that once you set up who the characters are and the scenarios that they're in, and then you just kind of develop, how that works itself out. And a lot of times, as that process gets complicated by more characters and more stories and you start to play it out, it sometimes doesn't go the way that you thought. Some of these characters are more evil or less evil than I thought they were going to be when I first set it out.
Hmm. All right. So a quote from the book. My father used to say that it was irresponsible on the part of the race for any human to be reckless with their health. There are so few of us. I was like, this hits hard. It's like there's a desperation of a species just to merely survive. Did you design this somehow to be analogous?
So I think yes and no. Where this idea comes from is from a movie I saw as a kid, and I have never been able to relocate again because I can't
Hmm.
remember what it's called. But as a kid, I saw this movie. It was a science fiction movie that was animated, and it had a fairly similar premise in that it was an intergalactic sci-fi. There weren't very many humans left, and the ones that were left were not treated super well.
Hmm.
And there's a moment in this movie, spoilers for some movie I've never been able to find the title of again. So there are two humans, one sort of a mentor character. He turns out to be evil, but then in the course of the big battle, he switches sides and turns back to the good guys side, and he says something to the effect of, there are so few of us left, we have to stick together.
Hmm.
And for 8-9 year old me, that was a really cool moment, and it's stuck with me since then. And I think that's an idea I return to somewhat. I mean, I think that in terms of being analogous to our present day circumstances, I don't see us as being in that struggle for survival as a species
Yeah.
bucket.
Yep.
But at the same time, I do think about I mean, that's something I do kind of believe about health and responsibility and taking care of yourself, and so that comes through to some extent too.
Hmm. All right. So there's a character. I really liked this because it was sad. I like sad stuff. There's a character who's functionally vegetarian because she could no longer keep cattle alive. So would you be able to tell me where that concept came from?
Yeah, so the part of the backstory, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say this, a part of the backstory of how humankind becomes so desperate that they are not wise in how they interact with first contact with the aliens. And so you've got the two stories going. You've got Liam on Grawl, and then you've got the backstory of how the humans got there in the first place. And part of
Right.
it is they're in these very desperate circumstances. And the context for that is largely climate change, with a couple of with also international superpower instability,
Right.
and sort of a massive Cold War. And so I was just basically trying to think out, and I wanted to portray this. You got some scenes that with the kind of governmental decision makers, but I also wanted to have some kind of on the ground stuff for
Mm.
everyday people.
Hmm.
How would something like this impact them? And that's one of the things that I thought of. I mean, I have never been a farmer. Like, I grew up as a kid in a small town,
Yeah.
but I mean, I grew up around several people that were, and and like my dad worked on hog farms and dairy farms before I was born. That's not what he does now, but um, and and like my brother used to work as a hired hand on a farm, and so like that kind of thing came to my mind, and that was just something that I thought of in terms of, if it's harder and harder to grow produce in the first place, it's harder and harder to grow produce for your animals too.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I like what you're saying there with like down on the ground. Like it's funny because I think a lot of times we can conceptualize things so grand, and it's having empathy at a ground level instead of just thinking of all these things as ideas, right?
Mhm.
Something I've been working on. All right. So you use the term sapiens,
Mhm.
and I just can't help but think of like the book Sapiens. I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't, but
No, but it's like I love the term sapiens like so much better than like humans. Like it's like when they're talking about sapiens as a species, I can't think of a better word for our species. Why did you go with sapiens?
I wanted so we use the term human so much, especially in the context of like talking about even like things that are very real and serious issues, right? Like human
Mhm.
rights, for example.
Yeah.
And I wanted to pick something that would give a little bit of a degree of separation
Yeah.
from like current political discussions about things and international politics and all of that. And also part of it was that the Grelic species is a culture that is there's a couple things about that culture that I think really comes out of the book and will continue to come out of the series. They highly prize, almost worship efficiency,
Hmm.
and to a certain degree formality. And so I thought that that made sense as like it's the biological designation, right? And so without just inventing a completely new word from their language, which I guess I could have done, I thought that that kind of came along. I thought that that kind of got that image across and gave us a little bit of separation there. And also Liam. So Liam is sort of a sky version of a street racer. Like he races with a jetpack and
Right.
metallic wings on his back, which you can see on the book cover. And his racing name is the Sapient Sensation. And I thought
Hmm.
that that had a nice ring to it too. And then
Hmm.
from there, I just kind of ran with it. Um, but I like that as and also I think something else that I always think about is when you're writing a sci-fi series with multiple races, but multiple of the races should be treated like people, it becomes tricky to think about how you use the word human being. So, like for example, if you have a different race of character, one of the recent projects I've been working on is a middle grade fantasy story, and it's there. I wanted to write at one point in the story an elf saying that's only human,
Hmm.
and then it's all like how do I say that? And so I just wanted to kind of avoid that entirely with the human designation and use something more specific, because human rights apply to alien races that are sentient in these kinds of
Yeah.
universes too.
Sentient. It's a great word. You must write. Um, okay, another thing. Enforcers. I love that instead of police, they're the enforcers. It kind of creates that like adverse relationship between them and the enforcers, or them and the, I guess, the authorities.
Mhm.
Do you think like this is reflective of some people groups' poor relationships with the police?
Yes and no. So it was not designed to be a strict allegory in a
Mm-hmm.
sense. So so clearly they once you read the story, you'll get a feel for that the Grolic people are very imperial. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is like an empire with intergalactic ambitions.
Right.
When I did that, I had in mind less of what we might think of certain Western empire, like the British Commonwealth, that kind of thing. And I had more in mind something along the lines of Rome or really even Babylon. So the way that humans end up on the planet is more akin to Babylon and how what they did with the people that they conquered than anything else.
Hmm.
And in that kind of mindset, the police are meant to be more militaristic than sort of the police military divide that we have in a lot of Western countries, which I think is a good divide, right? Now you will definitely see moments that are inspired by modern Western incidences of police brutality, for example, and even the
Hmm.
drug war comes out, which is of course a related issue. And so they are really meant to be adversarial. They are not a direct allegory in the sense that like there aren't really good guy cops in this story, just because that's not the role that they were meant to see. So I might have had a little bit more nuance there if I was looking for that to be more of a straight allegory, but it is a piece that certainly has elements of that to it, even though it's not a straight allegory.
Well, it's so interesting too because one of the enforcers loses his partner, and his partner's like 45 years old, and he's like trying to speak to the Sapiens and be like, "Look, I lost my partner. He was only 45," and they look at him like, that's like past the life expectancy of a sapien. It was kind of like a check your privilege moment. I was like, that's such a beautiful, beautiful thing. Okay. So I really like this too. I'm not even sure how to say the person's name. Bao,
Yeah.
Bao, Bao,
Yeah.
Bao,
Mm-hmm.
Bao. Are the lives we're taking really worth more than the lives we are saving? This is something like I've thought through a lot. Like when we talk about war, I remember I was wanting to have you on the podcast to talk about this actually, and I think I ended up doing an episode with someone else because you're like, I don't know a lot about just war theory, but it kind of is like a just war kind of premise, like to say, well, there's going to be some lives lost. Which lives are we going to decide to lose? Um, do you think that we often fall into making, the wrong decision in our Western empires when it comes to, which lives are worth saving and which lives are worth ending?
Yeah, so this gets to be a thorny issue, I think, if you're talking about things strictly in terms of international policy, because it's really hard to see to know for sure. I mean, even how much intel you have is good, what the long-reaching effects are going to be, or even things like the Vietnam War, which raged for years upon
That's
years,
crazy.
and the public was continually told that we're winning, it's going to be over soon, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Now, what Bao is getting at in part is extremism, because he works for a terrorist,
Right.
and one and who believes, as many terrorists do, that their actions are justly motivated. Like,
Right.
and a lot of it gets to, and this is something that is interesting to me because I see this in all kinds of books and movies and TV shows and comics and whatever, is just how dangerous and end justifies the means approach is to a lot of these things. And I think when you have that combined with a very, very strict us versus them mentality, it just kind of creates this toxic soup, and just a lot of people end up dying.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And I think part of it too is he, like, extremism, particularly violent extremism, really relies on this us versus them mentality and way of viewing the world. That if you're not in our little corner of verified saints, you're a demon, right?
Mm.
And I think that is part of what he's struggling with in that moment, is he's beginning to see, okay, all these power structures are really, really terrible. But some of these people who are living under these power structures aren't necessarily on their side. It's just where they were born. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so all of those things, I think, mixed together. I mean, I don't think that there's no such thing as a justified war.
Mhm.
I do think that there have been an awful lot of unjustified wars.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too because I'm seeing some of the talk of violence now on Parlay, and I'm just like, oh, this is scary. And I mean, like, even when you talk about like COVID too, and people going against the restrictions and all this stuff, and people really have this fixation with freedom and fighting for freedom. And I look at that and I'm like, freedom comes at a price. But I think we tend to only look at the price that's paid on the hero side, when in reality, there's some serious collateral damage. And that collateral damage can be civilians on the other side. It can be soldiers on the other side. It could be civilians on our side because they've lost their father or their mother. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's just so much. It's like I was just recently heard just kind of a synopsis of the French Revolution, and I'm like, I'm not really super familiar with it, but from hearing about it, I'm like, yeah, no, we don't want a revolution. Like, it's just super messy, like super messy. And then in the end, everybody's just like, can we just go back to the way things were?
Yeah. So this is really interesting, actually, because one of my favorite American founding fathers is John Adams,
Mm-hmm.
and I read this enormous biography of him by David McCullough, it's huge and takes forever to get through, but it's really good. It's just called John Adams. I'm pretty
Hmm.
sure it won a Nobel Prize for Literature.
Huh.
And one of the interesting things is that while he's president, or around that time, over the first couple presidents in the United States, is when the French Revolution is going on, and the
Hmm.
founding fathers were split on it
Hmm.
because so one of John Adams' big sticking points, which I think we need to talk about more, is he said that the American project could only work if the people were virtuous,
Hmm.
that without
Yeah.
virtue freedom would not work because it would just become license for vice, essentially.
Yes.
And to him, that was kind of what the French Revolution represented, because there was so much bloodletting and the guillotines and all
Hmm.
that stuff, and it just became kind of nihilist. Thomas Jefferson, interestingly enough, was quite a fan of the French Revolution, and he was like,
Crazy.
"Man, they should have at it." But and that was one source of kind of philosophical conflict between the two of them. But I mean, that's something that I think about when it comes to issues like this and the fight for freedom and all this kind of stuff, is that I want both freedom and virtue, but I think
Hmm.
John Adams had a point. I think that it becomes and I think that without virtue, some now I want to be careful here, because I don't want to, I'm a Christian, and openly
Hmm.
so. I don't want to
Hmm.
insinuate that anyone who's not a Christian is bound to become a violent revolutionary. But I
Right.
think if you don't have a fixed something that is a fixed standard external to yourself, you are going to end up getting swept way off course and end
Hmm.
up barely recognizing yourself and justifying all kinds of terrible things.
Yeah.
There's actually, I just finished reading Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson, which is
Hmm.
the third book in his Stormlight Archive series. And there's one of the characters goes through an arc that's that like kind of explicitly pulls out this idea. And when this character did not have something external to himself guiding his actions, he became very violent and very wicked. And that's something that I think we need to work through a little bit more with things like freedom and war and responsibility discussions.
Well, and it's funny you say that too. Not to get off track, but Adam Smith is another guy who was just like, yeah, the free market, the invisible hand. But then he wrote another book completely separate that was all talking about virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, again, he's assuming with virtue, this is what happens. And people are
Right.
like, forget the virtue, let's give freedom to everybody. And it's like, I don't think that works.
Yeah, so one of my favorite conservatives is Jonah Goldberg, and he wrote a book that came out, I think it was 2018, called "Suicide of the West." This
Hmm.
is, a great optimistic book, but
Hmm.
but kind of the thesis of the whole book is that that is basically that freedom and things like democracy and republics, they're not actually natural. That our instincts are to gather in tribes, to
Hmm.
follow a totalitarian charismatic leader, to hate the
Yeah.
other tribe,
Yeah.
all this stuff that we identify with very negative outcomes. Those are the natural things, but what we actually need is what when we do best. And for him, this is largely free market capitalism, but it would also include virtue along with this, that we have to impose. When we impose those things is when we actually get better outcomes for everybody. Because like one of the things that he talks about is he said we have this tendency to call things that we don't like unnatural, or things we recognize
Hmm.
as really bad and harmful as unnatural. But
Hmm.
he said that like one of the things that he thinks about is rape in wartime.
Hmm.
Strictly speaking, if you're just looking at universality among cultures, it's a very quote unquote natural thing, but it's
Yes.
horrible, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we need something to impose this other standard on us that says,
Hmm.
no, that's terrible, don't do that. And
Yeah.
that's just one example of the ways that this kind of works out, and why we need some sort of a guiding line. And
Mm.
without that, we become radicals and in some cases terrorists.
Well, and I mean, it's interesting too, because you're talking about like this system, on that planet. is basically built for efficiency.
Mhm.
And it's so funny because like just yesterday I was talking to a guy and we were talking about, how COVID has ravaged our economy and all this stuff, but it's all these like major, companies that are still afloat. And he's like, well, the problem is that the only thing capitalism values is efficiency. And so there's no humanity if we're not like actually being conscious of that, right? And so anyways, it's just interesting because it came up in the conversation yesterday. Okay, so now you also have, and I think this kind of goes in along the lines of the whole efficiency society built for efficiency. They then put all the elderly people in another town.
Mhm.
And so
Yep.
it's like, already, we kind of put our elderly people in homes and whatever, right? But it's like this is next level where you put them in a completely separate town. Um, is there kind of a specific lesson you were trying to teach in showing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's that you can't only think about efficiency,
Mm,
right? And because there's always this kind of tension. Well, so here's another example from one of my favorite books is Les Miserables. So Les Miserables is written by Victor Hugo. It's actually also
hmm.
French, and there's also some stuff about the French Revolution in it, which is interesting. But he was considered one of the great romantics, and the romantics, especially by Western conservatives, are frequently criticized for sort of an over reliance on emotion or on emotional appeal. And some
Hmm.
of that it really is warranted. At the same time, though, I think about the over reliance on strict logic and in this case strict efficiency,
Right.
and the problems that has. And so when you get one of these things out of balance, you have a lot of problems, and you have problems on
That's
the other
true.
side too. Like if you're relying totally on emotional appeal, you end up with some of the issues that we've had in Western culture recently, where you're in sort of a post-truth
Yeah.
society, as the term has been coined. But
Yeah.
also when you try to just completely cull emotion from the equation altogether, they're just, this is what makes sense for the division of labor. These old people can't work anymore, so we'll put them out here where all the
Right.
working people can be together and they can just be focused on what they need to do. It'll be a more efficient allocation of resources because all the people taking care of the old people will be in the same spot. And I think that, I'm not a person, I'm not a socialist. I'm not disparaging free market capitalism. I really think it's a great system. The novel isn't really about that itself so much. This is kind of behind the curtain inside baseball, just in terms of me thinking through it. But I think at the same time, we can, if we don't augment something like market forces and production and resource gathering with something else like virtue, then it becomes a real problem. And that's in large part what the side of the book that's about the way that Grolic society is run and how they interact with other peoples. That's really where all that comes from.
Hmm. Yeah. I think what I've been thinking a lot about too when it comes to freedom is like, raising children. And it's like how you want to build up their level of understanding of responsibility and then you give them freedom slowly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And anyways, I'm not sure why I went on that tangent. But all right. So Tikin's mother, she says what gives you the most relief is not the same as what's best for everyone around you. I guess this is like where it plays into kind of that emotional thing. He's a very emotional character and he acts out and he gets
Mm-hmm.
violent, but his violence goes way too far. And it's like, no, I was just defending my friend. And it's like, yeah, but you took it too far. Um,
And that's not what the friend wanted. Like,
yeah, that's
and
it too. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and so I like him. He's
Yeah.
I mean, I would hope I would like my characters, I guess. But uh
Yeah.
so this is where this particular element is where some of the more social things came out. So when I first wrote this, it was supposed to be, believe it or not, a pretty lighthearted, fun space adventure, that you could just kind of pick up and fly through, and uh, and even the original title I had for it, I shared the title in one of my working groups, and I was like, what would you think the tone of this book is by this title? And everybody's like, oh, that sounds like a nice middle grade 12, 13-year-old boy action adventure. And the more I wrote it, it's like it got to be not that. And
Yeah.
but where this came in is the world that I was set up and developing was one in which you had a lot of racism against humans, and a lot of explicit discrimination against them, and some of that in ways that's analogous to civil rights issues that we could talk about in
Right.
American history too. But one of the big things that I wanted to kind of explore a little bit with him is that a lot of people will proclaim themselves allies without ever asking the people that they are allies to what they actually want, or what the actual needs of their community are.
Yeah, that's huge.
And what
Yeah.
I think we see sometimes is people who are doing activism, and there are people doing really great activism when it comes
Yeah.
to racism and all sorts of social issues, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes, especially with what we might call hashtag activism or keyboard activism,
Yeah.
is people who are putting stuff out there to make themselves feel better about,
Hmm.
look, I did something, but they're not stopping to look and see, okay, is this going to actually be helpful? Is this speaking to what this community or these individual people actually need? And
Yeah.
when you do that, it really becomes about me, not about the people that I'm trying to help. I mean, it's kind of like, I remember one time in Bible class that we were studying through James. And James has a lot about, so the Bible has lots of stuff about, that you're not saved by works. But James comes along and says, but it's also actually important that you're doing good things as part of your Christian walk, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking about that, and I remember that I was leading the class and trying to be focused on the idea that we're not here just to warm a pew, right? That like we need to be looking for opportunities to do good things and to serve other people. And somebody in the class brought up the point that it's not even only that we do things, it's also a question of what the motivations are for those things.
Mm.
Because to take kind of a boilerplate example, if you're helping the little old lady cross the street, not because you care particularly about her, but because you want to be seen doing it, or even if it's primarily to get this warm, fuzzy feeling in your heart, then you're going about it the wrong way. It reminds me too of somebody else in our church who has done some foster care. And I remember those situations, sometimes you get kids who are really troubled. They've been in really terrible circumstances. And because of that, their behavior is sometimes troubled, and that can put you in difficult situations. And he mentioned that to say that, like, doing the right thing doesn't always fill you with a warm, fuzzy feeling. Sometimes it's really hard. And
Yeah.
sometimes it doesn't quote unquote feel good, but you do it because it's the right thing and you're trying to help other people, not try and make yourself feel nice and warm and fuzzy. And
Yeah.
that is just an idea that I think, especially in a selfie culture, we need to re-examine a lot.
Definitely. And I think there's something to humility, where you can say, like, you know what matters is that this person's voice is heard.
Mhm.
People are not hearing this person. So I have a choice. I can either speak up for them and be the white savior or whatever color savior you want to be, or I can give them a mic, you know? And I think that there needs to be more of that. And I think that's part of the critique of social justice, culture, or social justice warriors, is that there's just a whole lot of people that want to be heroes. And it's like, no, it shouldn't be about that. It should be about
Mhm.
righting wrongs and figuring out how to fix things and giving people voices for them to tell you what they want.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, I there's something too incredible to me about your writing, because you're able to have grit to it, but you never really cross lines that, you know, as a Christian, you shouldn't cross. And I mean, like, even, you know, there's that scene where the guy's got like, I don't know how many fists. Is it like 6 fists where he's pounding the guy? Like, it's like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like you know, getting pounded by 2 fists is incredibly violent, but now because this guy's an alien, he's got all these fists. It's like the other thing I thought was really interesting too was you came up with the swear word, shawl, and it's just incredible because I'm convinced it's a vulgar word, you
Mhm.
know, in the book. So this like vulgarity, like being able to kind of tread that line, is there like an author that's inspired you in how you do that?
So yes and no. So this is the second time I've done this for a book. So I first did this type of thing with an Exalted Depravity, which is
Yeah.
a dystopian fiction book I wrote from 2016. And in that one, I tried to, you know, come up with some what would be some more or less some new swear words. That the idea of that kind of came. This is going to be a weird connection, but just stick with me for a minute. From watching Batman Beyond, which I
Uh-huh.
grew up on and absolutely loved. Not that there
It
were
was cool.
swear words in it, but they kind of had their own futuristic lingo with their own
Mm.
like teenager slang and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And one of the things I always struggled with is I want to depict worlds that are not so squeaky clean that they're obviously imaginary.
Yeah.
Even for something like science fiction, I'm like, you know, this guy's a terrorist. He's not going to say, "Oh gosh darn it." You
Yeah.
know, but I
Yeah.
also don't want to, you know, lean into that so much that one, that the book is going to cause, you know, conscience issues for some Christians reading it.
Right.
And also that, like, I also want the book to be accessible for, you know, somewhat younger audiences who, you know, can handle kind of the dark tone of it and all that sort of thing.
Right.
And so that's why I first did that for an Exalted Depravity, is I felt like this gets across that they're not just saying "oh shucks" all the time, but at the same time gets across the kind of the edginess a little bit.
Mhm.
And then after I wrote An Exalted Depravity, I read Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive books, which I've read for it's now, and he does the same thing.
Hmm.
And now his is a little bit more developed in that his swear words are things that are specific to the world building of that story. That, you
Yeah.
know, in this book, it's more just made up words from the language.
Mhm.
But that is kind of the idea of what I was wanting to do, which I think worked.
Yeah, it did.
And you know, and I'm not like, you know, I watch R-rated movies, you know, I
Yeah.
read Stephen King books, like,
Yeah.
but I also want, I want my stories to also be accessible for people who maybe aren't going to be doing that. And you know, if I am going to use like actual swear words, I want it to be meaningful and not
Yeah.
just something that, you know, I'm sure you've seen movies like this where it's like by the time you hear the 50th F word in the movie, it's like, dude, what's the point? Like,
Yeah.
then when like if you wanted it to mean something, it doesn't mean anything because you use it 50 times.
Yeah, that's when you have to start using the Lord's name in vain, right? Like it's like that's basically what they do in writing, right? They're like, now we're gonna have to drop something else. Um, it's kind of like with music. It's like if you do too much heaviness, it's like, well, there's no light to it, and you know,
Yeah.
like it's like you've got to have dynamics. Um, so I really like there's a description. I think one of your characters goes into a description of this alien race that are advanced enough to keep and capable of developing new technology, and yet they choose to be hunter gatherers instead. Despite this capacity to live the efficient life, they choose to be hunter gatherers. And this kind of brings me back to Yuval Noah Harari, which we did a couple episodes on that um, on this podcast. But it was one of my favorite parts of his book. Is he talks about how the agricultural revolution is the greatest scam in the history of humanity. And he basically explains because, what happened prior to the agricultural revolution is humans would wake up, they go find food, they come back, they'd eat it. That was their life. And that's all they did. And if there wasn't food where they lived, they would just move on to another place and they would, do that, right? And he said when agriculture came along, they lived in a fixed location, which meant they had to now start planning for the future and started thinking months in advance, years in advance, all the time. And so for the first time, humans experienced anxiety. And then, you get like a population boom, and now we're a society that has grown so much that it's not possible for us to be hunter gatherers. And anyways, would you agree with Harari's assessment on that?
Uh, I think, well, for one, I think that there might be a point there when it comes to food security, but I am skeptical that that is the first time that humans experienced anxiety. Because, like at a certain point, they had to be worried about being eaten by lions or tigers or, whatever. Like there are lots of real dangers, war still happened all the time. So where I am more coming from with that particular inclusion is I read this really good book called The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Truer. And this is a book that is about the history of Native American people in North America. And it's really, really good. But one of the more interesting things about the book that isn't even just so the book does have a lot in it about the ways that the United States government and the colonies really horribly mistreated them, took advantage of them, all that stuff. It also has a lot of interesting and positive things about their history, which is part of what he says in the introduction that he wants to do with the book, is that like it's a lot of times the story of his people is only one of loss, and it's never one about the good. And so he wanted to present both. And one of the things that was interesting to me is that being a hunter-gatherer is actually we tend to shortchange it too much. It's actually fairly sophisticated. And there are some people in modern tribes that are still doing a form of it. And there are also Native American people and tribes that would do sort of a hybrid where they would farm some land for part of the year, and then they would move, like across the river or something to another location where they would do more like hunter-gatherer stuff for that part of the year. And it would just kind of go in a cycle, and that would allow the soil to rotate and all that kind of stuff. And I was just like, man, we have so shortchanged this just because we are so used to the modern Western way of doing food, doing farming. And I really wanted to portray with this other alien race, I wanted to portray a culture that was not doing things the quote unquote sophisticated or modern way, but it wasn't because they weren't smart enough. Because and that was really what I was wanting to get at, is that there's more to life than efficiency. And sometimes it's not just about the smart people made all of these advances, right? Different people are smart in different ways. I mean, this is something that I remember I would hear talks about racism, even in church. The example I'm thinking of, which is if you are talking about the people that we call quote unquote savage, maybe in whatever continent or people you want to talk about, even if you're talking to somebody who would still live in that way, which, there are still tribes in different parts of the world who still, live in a way that, we would talk about disparagingly. If you're stranded in the wilderness and there's a thunderstorm coming and you don't know how to build a shelter, but you've got a PhD in economics from Harvard University, how much good does it do you?
Well, that's it, right? Like, and I've done, we did a missions trip to one of the local indigenous tribes, in our area.
Mhm.
I also did a trip with my kids to, I think it was some Blackfoot um, area. And, in both trips, what like blew my mind was the ingenuity um, of how, like, it's like, we're going to use every part of the buffalo. And I'm like, what? And so then, like, a bunch of white folk, from Europe come and say, you guys are dumb. You need to be like us. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, what would have happened if the Europeans actually said, hey, how about you teach us some things that you know, and we'll teach you some things that we know? And because I think, like, I don't think we'd be in the same environmental mess we are in right now if we would have listened to our indigenous people. And I think this is something I think a lot about too, spiritually, because it's like we have a tendency, as Christians to walk up to people and say, okay, forget everything you know, it's garbage. Now I'm going to teach you everything I know, right? And it's like, that's not, no, nobody wants that. And like, it's like your belief system sucks if you never listen to anyone else, right? Because it's like, honestly, it's like Jordan Peterson says, assume that every person you meet can teach you something you don't know. And
Mhm.
I'm like, that is such a beautiful approach to people, and then you can be like the Apostle Paul and be like, hey, you guys have all these altars to the unknown God. I found him.
Yeah, yeah. Oh man, the Mars Hill sermon is one of my favorite
Mm.
chapters of scripture. It's just it's fantastic for that very reason. This also reminds me of another great book that is not even tangentially related to sci-fi, but I'm going to recommend it.
Yeah.
It's called The Great Alone,
Hmm.
by Kristen Hanna. Kristen Hanna's a terrific writer, and this is about a family that decides that they're going to move out to Alaska and like northern Alaska and
Mm.
homestead.
Uh-huh.
And they have no idea what they're doing. Now,
Mm.
like the book is like the Alaskan and they're in a very remote place, like this village of a few dozen people, um and it doesn't have what we've been talking about in terms of like the indigenous people aspect so much. But one of the things is like there is so much that you just don't know about these people living in Alaska in a village of 50 people.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
even like stuff like so they have this. I'm feeling very unintelligent for forgetting the term for this, so I'm just going to say the cold building where you keep your meat over the winter outside. they
Yeah.
did
Yeah.
they didn't build it up high, like they just had like this building for it. They're like, okay, that's where we keep it. Well, a bear got into it, and then the
Huh.
people are like, what are you doing? You have to build it up on, and like there's a description for what they do, but it's basically you have to build
Mm.
it up on a high platform, like basically
So
on
the
top of a
bears can't
tall
get it.
pole or something, so that the
Mm.
bears can't reach it.
Yeah.
And it's stuff like that that's like, and so getting back to this particular culture, like this is a culture that, by the way, this is the people that I'm talking about now. This is where the majority of the second book is going to take place. But they are a culture that is going that like shares some
Oh,
of those things in
sweet.
common, as being like they're very naturalist. They have a very positive relationship with nature, um, but they're also very intelligent. They have a very developed literary culture, and I think that all of these things, like these can all be true at the same time. These cultures have a lot to teach each other. I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
that you might get the impression that I like, that I want to crap on the Industrial Revolution or something.
Hmm.
That's not it either. I just
No.
think a lot of these cultures have things to teach each other, and that sometimes, at least in my circles, we tend to slide, I think, too much towards the what's good for business, what's most efficient, and just kind of drum it out, and not enough time slowing down and thinking not just about efficiency. Did I get all of my checklist things off? But to make room for, are we appreciating the people and the relationships in our life, not just how much stuff we have in our career track? And are we stopping and smelling the roses, so to speak? Um, and one of the things that was also an inspiration for kind of this approach is there's someone I know who is a Native American, and one of the things that
Mm,
he told me is that so he lives across the country from where his tribe is originally from. But every
right.
so many years, they gather together at their the the land where they're from, and he said that it's part of their culture that they reconnect with the land.
Hmm.
And you know, not that I think that you need to have a, you know, if you're not part of that culture, that you should have a connection to a specific plot of land or something like that, but the idea of feeling connected to the world that you live in and to the nature that God has given us, I think we need more of a, and you know, I'm not a climate change alarmist, like it's
Mhm.
not that, but like I think we need to have a lot more of a sense of appreciation and stewardship for
Right.
what we've been given, rather than a domineering or a domination orientation.
Totally. And I know like when we went, like really this mission trip that we took was like more about learning, like it
Mhm.
wasn't like, oh, we're gonna tell you guys, and and I thought something that was really interesting is like they said that their teepee is always facing, like the door of the teepee was always facing where the sun was gonna rise. So that when they woke up, they could see the sun. And they said, a lot of Europeans thought that we worshiped the sun. And they're like, that's not what it was. It's like every morning we'd wake up, open up our door, and thank the creator for the sun. And I'm like, that is beautiful. Yeah. Okay. Yamka, chosen family. I love that so much. I'm like, why does English not have a word for that?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
there is
it's
just something super special about a chosen family. And I guess this kind of is juxtaposed against that culture of efficiency because you're
mhm.
actually looking at connection.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's an idea that so we talked at the very opening about the impacts that the pandemic is having on isolation, depression,
Yeah.
loneliness, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking over the last couple of years about how difficult it is to maintain friendships as adults.
Hmm.
So you know, I'm still pretty young. I'm in my late 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in college, it just seemed easy. You know, like I lived in a townhouse with four other guys. There were five of us,
Right.
4-bedroom townhouse. You know, I was always doing stuff. There was an active group at the church I was at. You know, and you know, when you're in high school, you're kind of stuck in the building all day with people, and so
Yeah.
you know, gather to people, and you know, there's social stuff going on. When you're an adult, especially once you're married and you have a couple kids, and you're like, I can't go to the midnight showing of the movie. I have a baby
Yeah.
that's not
Yeah.
sleeping, you know. And I've just been thinking about how huge personal connection is, not
Yeah.
just within the like the nuclear family is super important, like,
Yeah.
but also relationships beyond that are really important too.
Yeah.
So my wife has been reading this book called H is for Hawk, and it's
Mhm.
about this person. I think it's basically, I'm not reading it, but she is, and she's been sharing stuff from it with me. It's a memoir, and it's about this person who's like, she works with birds,
Hmm.
and she works with hawks. And she talks about after one of her parents died, I think it was her father, that she went into this period of isolation. Like she just dove into nature, and like that's how she was going to deal with her grief. And she said that it didn't work. And one of
Hmm.
the things that she learned is that she said hands are for other humans to hold, not just
Huh.
for hawks to perch on.
Huh.
And that's an idea that since she told me that, so this was just a couple days ago that she told me that, but like the idea keeps coming through my mind. I was talking to a close friend of mine who grew up in the same state as me. He now lives in Texas, and we were talking about we were talking about the same thing with the pandemic, about like how hard it is, because like, and even like, you know, I'm going to church in person, we're doing the proper restrictions, but like it's not the same because you're
Yeah.
masked, you know, you're 6 feet apart. There are good reasons we're doing that, but
Yeah.
it's still, you know, an impact of the pandemic. And like, and it just got us thinking about how like God could have told us to do the whole Christian thing on our own, right? Like, make sure you pray to me, make sure you sing songs to me, read this compilation of text that I'm going to give you, you know, but like all of the New Testament is functioned around a community.
Right.
And like, and it's not like, so like in the Old Testament, that's because like he chose a nation, right? In the New Testament, it's like you have a completely new covenant, but there is still a very strong community aspect of it. I mean, you
Yeah.
read the epistles, there are certain books that are largely about individual practice or individual theology. I mean, a lot of Romans is kind of about the theology of sin and all that stuff, but a lot of the epistles are about the church and interacting with each other as believers, how that is complicated, and to a large extent that we need community. And like that just that idea just really keeps resonating with me, whether you're talking about adult friendships, whether you're talking about the church, whatever it is. I mean, just community is really, really, really huge for humans. In some cases, even introverted ones. I mean, I'm super extroverted. My wife is super introverted, but loath as she is to admit it, she misses people sometimes during all this stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, beautiful book. Thank you so much for coming on to share about it.
Yeah.
So where can people get the book?
On Amazon. So it is exclusive to Amazon at the moment,
Oh,
but
okay.
it is available on ebook and paperback. And actually, when this drops, I'm doing a Black Friday sale on all of my books, not just this one, but all the ebook versions will be 99 cents through
Awesome.
Cyber Monday in the US, which is November 30th. So it's a perfect time to grab it.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Air Smudge.